All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the HASS Behavior Job Alike monthly meeting. I'm going to put a link to the agenda in chat so that everyone can see it. Would love if everyone who's online can do a quick introduction of yourself in terms of who you are, where you're from, and who you work with if you do work in behavior. And also would love to hear from you all if there's a behavior book or podcast or YouTube channel or something that you've started reading or listening to lately. We'd love to hear about that. Always looking for new things to learn about. I'm going to start with a little bit of background for those of you who are new to us. Human Animal Support Services, this is the HASS Behavior Job Alike group. But Human Animal Support Services, the primary goal is to keep people and pets together. HASS brings animal welfare organizations and community members together to engage in partnerships that support the bond of people and animals. So that's our overall goal, and it's a collaborative effort facilitated by American Pets Alive with a lot of different funders behind it to support the efforts. Most of us who are working for HASS do so on a volunteer basis because we're so excited about helping people and pets. Our Job Alike group that you're all here for today, we're a group of people who are interested in dog and cat behavior. Some of us are brand new to the field. Some of us have years and years and years of experience. Everybody's welcome. We meet monthly on the last Thursday of the month to learn and talk about behavior topics that help to keep dogs and cats in homes, as well as shelter behavior topics. Today, I'm really excited that we are going to be talking about debunking myths for dogs that come from a dog fighting background. But before I do that, I'm always interested in learning about what's going on out there. So I just wanted to open up the floor to see if anybody knows of any upcoming conferences, webcasts, anything like that. Please feel free to unmute yourself and tell us about it or type it into the chat. Looks like there's no updates right now. I feel like there's something that's coming up that I'm forgetting about, but.
Yeah, this weekend is the online cat conference.
Thank you.
I don't have a link handy right now. I apologize.
I think Clicker Expo might be this weekend as well. I'm not sure.
And then we have a couple people mentioning the Lemonade Conference from the IAAPC. That's an amazing conference. Highly recommend it. Another conference to mention is the My Dog is My Home conference. It's at the beginning of March. This is a conference about supporting homeless people and their pets and helping to keep them together. So it's a little bit of a different topic than behavior, but it's a really good one. All right, well, we will jump right in then. So today we have Dr. Carley Faughn of Best Friends Animal Society and Morgan Rivera of the Humane Society of the United States, who are going to be talking to us about debunking myths, dogs from dog fighting backgrounds. Welcome, Dr. Carley and Morgan. I'll turn it over to you guys.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sheila. So today we're going to be talking about discussing myths around dogs coming from dog fighting backgrounds. And as you'll see and hear throughout the presentation, much of our talk will focus on some case studies for dogs that come from this background. So as Dr. Sheila mentioned, my name is Dr. Carley Faughn, and I'm an animal behaviorist and currently the senior strategist for life-saving research with Best Friends Animal Society. Prior to this role, though, I used to oversee Dogtown here at the sanctuary, a few other animal care areas here at the sanctuary, and had previously overseen the behavior team. I have a PhD in cognitive science, focusing on animal behavior and cognition. And I've worked with a variety of species over the years in rescue, from non-human primates to cats and dogs, since around 2006, 2007. And I will pass it over to Morgan now.
Hello, I am Morgan Rivera. I'm graduating this spring with a master's in shelter medicine, And I've been involved in animal welfare in some form or fashion since about 2003. I've filled a variety of roles in that time, many of them behavior roles or shelter management roles. And for about the last 5 years, I've worked for the Humane Society of the United States, which has taken me all over the country and given me a whole host of experiences from disaster response to consulting with shelters, and my favorite, which is working with survivors of dogfighting. So very excited to be talking with you all about this today. And let's just jump right in. You want to switch slides, Dr. Carley? Okay, so something that I think many people may be wondering is, why does dogfighting even still exist today? Dr. Carley will touch on this a little later, but you probably all know it's been made illegal in all 50 states. So why is it still around? The answer to that is quite complex, and we probably could spend hours just trying to analyze all of the reasons why it still exists today, but obviously we don't have time for that. So we both felt it was more prudent to spend today discussing the dogs, the victims, and how we as animal professionals can best serve them. So because history can shed light on the present sometimes, I'm going to touch a little on that to start. Blood sports are something that have existed in some form or fashion for nearly as long as man has existed. From ancient Roman gladiators to modern day matadors, these are sports that are viewed as barbaric by some, probably everyone on this call today, but highly entertaining by others. They can be human on human, such as boxing, human on animal, such as bullfighting, or animal on animal, such as dog or cockfighting. Regardless of the type of blood sport, it doesn't take somebody that has studied psychology to understand that these sports are in many ways used to prove one's masculinity, or even just as a stand-in for their own conflicts. In one article, the authors Kaloff and Taylor state, dogfighting as a blood sport is centered around sexuality, masculine values, and the deployment of animals as symbols of a culture infused with macho aggression and menacing violence. The important thing to take away from our message today is that at the end of the day, dogfighting is really much more about the humans than it is about the dogs, which is why you will hear us say often throughout this presentation that we really should be simply treating the dogs as individuals. Next slide. Okay, so how did dogfighting evolve here in the United States? In the early 1800s, dogfighting became part of the American culture and then exploded in popularity after bull and bear baiting, which are other blood sports, became illegal in the 1830s. By the 1860s, professional fighting pits, often with police and firemen in attendance, were commonplace, especially in the northeast part of our country, where it rose in popularity largely due to an Irish immigrant in New York City who went by the nickname of Kit Burns. Burns was incredibly well known in New York for his fights, and they often, again, had officers of the law in attendance and even participation. Dogfighting by law enforcement is still a very real issue today, and it has led to the inability to move forward with many cases despite there being ample evidence. Next slide. In 1954, Galbert Trahan, also known as Gaboon, who you can see pictured on the left-hand side of this screen, wrote the rule book that is still used for organized dogfighting today. Take note that his bio says lifelong law enforcement. His rules are known as the Cajun rules and are simple, and in a summary written by Mitch Kemmer, son of the infamous dogfighter Norman Kemmer, he states, the rules are basically common sense and meant to allow either dog the opportunity to stop the combat at any point that he, the dog, has had enough. Remember, this is a sport, and as long as all parties involved conduct themselves like gentlemen, it will remain so. So that's pretty cringeworthy, right? I'm going to pause right here, and I want to give you all a little disclaimer. On the next slide, you're going to see some colorful language, but I do want to share it anyways, because this is the reality of what people that participate in dogfighting are like. And a little later on, I'm going to have another slide with even more colorful language. So I'll warn you before we get to that, but if you have little kiddos around, you might want to send them out of the room for a snack. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so while Gaboon's rules were short and simple, we don't believe that going through each and every one of them will serve to benefit the message we're trying to send today. But I do want to touch a little on the terminology used by dog fighters because you'll see it come up again later in the presentation. The first is game or gameness, and this is essentially the dog's willingness to continue fighting even after they've been gravely injured. And then the opposite of that is a cur, which is the term utilized by dog fighters to describe dogs that are not game. There really is nothing much worse to a dog fighter than if his dog turns, which means that they are attempting to disengage from the fight. At that point, they are usually deemed a cur, and it's not uncommon for them to be killed, often in a brutal manner, in an attempt by the owner to regain some of their lost perceived masculinity. So the picture on the right-hand side of this slide is actually a screen cap from a known dog fighter sharing with his friends what it takes to be part of the game of dog fighting. So saying it again now, dog fighting is about the people, not the dogs. Next slide. Okay, so at this point, I want to just touch briefly on the different levels of dog fighters, because by understanding the different levels, it can help us understand some of the myths that I'm then going to work on debunking. First, there are professional dog fighters who are individuals that have established bloodlines. They've developed their own methods for conditioning their dogs before fights, and they will only fight their dogs under a contracted match, typically with significant amounts of money being bet on the outcome of those matches. Below the professional level are what's considered hobbyists or amateur fighters. They typically are not going to have their own bloodlines established, and they will often seek out professionals to mentor them in what they view as the art of conditioning and creating bloodlines. And they'll also seek out advice on who it is and isn't safe to work with, because again, this is illegal. Below that, you have the street level fighters. Experts agree that these are far less common than what we might have once thought, but they may still exist to a small extent. What we previously considered street fighters were really probably just people that enjoyed carrying out acts of animal cruelty. Yes, they may have allowed their dogs to get into a fight, but really this is much more likely a person that gets enjoyment or some sort of fulfillment out of carrying out these acts of violence. So Chris Schindler, who is a friend and former colleague of mine, is the Vice President of Field Services for HRA and St. Hubert's, and he's the former Director of Animal Fighting and Cruelty for HSUS and HSI. He recently shared with me that as little as about 15 years ago, the dogs that were kept on yards by professional dog fighters were so well cared for that law enforcement would only have been able to get a warrant if they had solid evidence of actual dog fighting. So through old timers either naturally passing or being taken out of the game through arrests, the new wave of dog fighters have significantly lowered the levels of care that they provide to their dogs. And those dogs are now viewed by them as much more a tool for gambling than what they once were. So I share that not to glorify the old days by any means, but to explain today that many times law enforcement is actually able to get warrants for improper care and other things that are easier to prove than dog fighting. Okay, next slide. So let's take a pause from all of that and do a little case study. So the dog here is Stephanie, and she was part of a seizure that we did last summer in North Carolina. The whole case is actually thanks to Stephanie and the law enforcement officers that found her. So they had just taken a course where we teach about identifying the signs of dog fighting, and they were out at a property with a drug-related search warrant and noticed signs that were indicative of dog fighting. So they actually asked the owner if he wanted them to take two of his dogs that were in really poor condition, Stephanie being one of them, to the vet for him. And the defendant, so confident that he was smarter than the police and they wouldn't have noticed all of the very obvious signs of dog fighting, told them to go for it. So according to him, Stephanie was his favorite dog. And despite that, when she arrived at the shelter, she was a body condition score of 2. So in this picture here, it was taken about 2 weeks after she'd been in the shelter receiving proper care, proper nutrition. But as you can see, she still has pretty prominent hip bones and ribs. So while we were doing her exam, this girl was off the walls, a total silly, goofy wrecking ball. And I'm pretty sure in that exact moment, we all fell in love with her. Next slide. So in this instance, we were extremely fortunate to promptly get custody of the dogs. And Stephanie, along with 6 other dogs, went to one of our really incredible partners, Mr. Bones & Co. Ellie, who is the president of the rescue, brought her helper dog to meet the survivors and help us get a sense for how the dogs may do with other dogs. So I'm going to call myself out here because I actually allowed what the defendant said about her being his favorite to color how I went into the meeting between the helper dog and Stephanie. We did put a muzzle on her just in the name of safety and caution. And I was expecting it to be a very short interaction. And I thought that she was going to show us that she would not do well with other dogs. But she pretty instantly proved me wrong. She went up to the helper dog and was basically like, oh, hey, so you're friends with these people. I like these people. Cool, let's hang out. So shame on me for giving her history too much weight and not looking at the dog in front of me. So I just want to say it all again. Dogs are individuals. Get to know them. Get to know the dog right in front of you. So pretty quickly, Ellie was like, yeah, this girl's coming home with us. So Stephanie went on to be fostered by a lovely couple that live in Brooklyn, where she thrived visiting dog parks and pretty much stole the hearts of everyone that met her. So while it's probably safe to assume that she was the favorite of the defendant for nefarious reasons, she immediately proved to all of us that she's an absolute comedian and full of nothing but love and laughter. Ellie was a little concerned that her sweet gray muzzle might make it a little harder for people to view her as the spunky, fun-loving girl that she is, but I'm really proud to tell you all that she has been adopted by a family that I believe live on Long Island. Don't quote me on that. And they have a daughter with autism that is now Stephanie's best friend in the world. And the dad is also a police officer, which I think is pretty special. Her story kind of came full circle. So Stephanie is nothing if not a prime example of why we need to look at the dog that is right in front of us. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's get back to business and focus on some of the myths. One of the big myths around dog fighting is that the dogs enjoy it. In fact, flourishing is a concept that is used by some dog fighters to defend their sport. Their stance is that fighting is in the nature of pit bulls and that by not allowing them opportunities to fight, you are not allowing them the ability to express their truest selves. It's pretty ridiculous. Free-roaming dogs obviously never organize themselves into fights the way that fighters do. And yes, dog fights do occur by both street dogs and owned dogs of all breeds alike. But the organized manner in which dog fighters carry out the sport is not naturally occurring. In fact, professional dog fighters often have to breed litter after litter of dogs just to get one that exhibits the trait that they are looking for. There was an infamous dog fighter that actually went and dug up a bone from a grand champion named Jeep. And he took that bone to different labs around the country in an attempt to have the dog cloned. So despite spending tens of thousands of dollars, he was unsuccessful. And today he actually has the stuffed corpse of one of Jeep's offspring in his home. In another incident, a confidential informant witnessed one dog fighter kill over 20 dogs in one day because they were not displaying the traits he sought, and he was frustrated for having bred so many litters and not producing any dogs that he deemed capable of fighting. So I share those gruesome stories to hopefully illustrate for you the great lengths that professional dog fighters will go to just to get 1 or 2 dogs that will participate in fights for them. So to say that nature or fighting is in their nature is simply wrong. Next slide. Will Grigsby, a professional boxer turned dog fighter, once said, "To me, it's just like boxing. It's cruel if you put a pit bull on a poodle or a pit bull on another pit bull that don't want to fight. But if you have 2 dogs that weigh the same amount in an organized fight, well, that's just like boxing." So this is clearly an example of a fighter that believes that by fighting his dogs, he's allowing them to flourish. The truth is there's a complete range of personalities in fight bust dogs, the same way there's a complete range of personalities for all dogs. I have met many survivors over the years, and actually every single dog pictured in this presentation is from a fighting case. And I personally have had the honor of sharing my home with some spunky young dogs, but also some old, lazy mamas that come from fighting cases. Next slide. So on the opposite end of the spectrum from the old ladies that I had are dogs like Solo, who's the next case study I want to talk about. She was adopted by a friend of mine, Jessie, who is the president of another incredible group called Even Chance Pit Bull Rescue. They focus their efforts on rescuing pit bulls, many of whom are from fight busts. And Jessie loves the spirit and drive that exists in some pit bulls and actively seeks out ones that might be too much for the average adopter. She then spends so much time channeling that energy into appropriate sports and has some of truly the most incredible dogs I've ever met. This picture here is of what she lovingly refers to as her 5-pack, and Solo is the cute little girl up front with the purple sweater on. Next slide. So Solo was rescued from the Detroit Police Department when she was just a puppy, along with her litter mates. Jessie was called in to see if she might be able to assist with taking some of the dogs, and Solo was one of the lucky pups that got to leave that day with her and join the Even Chance Rescue Group. Jessie herself ended up fostering Solo, and Solo has never left her house. As a puppy, Solo was fed infant formula by the defendant rather than allowing her to feed from her mother's breast milk. And she was underweight and just really not thriving compared to some of her litter mates. In the beginning, she was not a good eater, and it took quite a while for Jessie to get her GI issues under control. But today, as you can see, this girl is thriving. So Jessie says that Solo's actually taught her an awful lot about training and the need to go slow and meet the dog's needs that are right in front of you. Solo is a sensitive little lady, and she would fold under pressure. Despite being incredibly smart, she needs to learn things at her own very careful pace. And due to her, or because of her, Jessie learned how to free shape, which is pretty cool to see. So today, Solo has a roster of tricks that is quite long, including sit, down, stay, climb, orbit, sit pretty, go around, go through, go over, play disc, flip for the disc, and a whole bunch more that I'm sure I'm forgetting, but the list is very long and very impressive. So next slide. So I wanted to end on this picture here of Solo with her family because they are an incredible example of what it means to treat each dog as an individual. Punk is the little girl on the left-hand side, and she was part of a case with the ASPCA and was in their custody in a temporary shelter for years where she was deteriorating, not due to having her needs met. Euthanasia was being considered for her due to her poor quality of life, but they agreed to allow Jessie to foster her in witness protection. And it took 3 years before her hold was released by the courts and she was able to officially be adopted. Next to her is Simon, who was adopted as a puppy and then years later was quite tragically found in the apartment with his owner who was deceased due to a gunshot wound. So Simon is pretty strongly dog aggressive, but as you can see see here, he's learned how to happily live with other dogs thanks to Jesse's unwavering devotion to dogs from her rescue. And then you have tiny little Luna, and I am madly in love with this little girl. I've watched her matrix across the fence and balance on top, attempting to catch squirrels. So she has a heck of a prairie drive, and she can't be around puppies, but she's an amazing helper dog. And then next to her, you have Solo and Zephyr. Zephyr is on top, and he is quite the wonderful, distinguished gentleman at 13 years old. His people absolutely come first, and he's pretty indifferent towards other dogs, but little Solo is able to get him to play every now and then. So take it from Jesse with Even Chance. This gorgeous crew right here is a prime example of why it's really crucial to treat every dog as the individual that's right in front of you and look at their specific needs. And before Dr. Carley advances to the next slide, I do want to give another quick disclaimer. The slide's going to have some colorful language. I apologize in advance, but I think it's prudent to the conversation. So next slide. All right, so let's talk about what is likely the most prolific and damaging myth of them all, bait dogs. Plain and simple, this is a myth. Chris Schindler, who I mentioned earlier, has at this point in his career literally investigated thousands of dogfighting cases and says that not one single time has he found a shred of evidence to indicate a dog was used as bait. Even confidential informants and members of law enforcement that have been embedded in fighting operations for months, sometimes even years, report zero instances of a dog being used as bait. Bait dogs would serve absolutely zero purpose for dog fighters. They are never going to engage their dogs in a fight if it isn't a contracted match with a dog of the exact same weight where money is being bet. Remember, dogfighting, like other blood sports, exists not just to show off the owner's masculinity, but to hopefully win those owners lots of money. So, in fact, that brings me to the image on the screen. I can let the dogfighters themselves debunk this myth. It's a little hard to read because the text is small, but the picture you're seeing is a screen grab from a messaging board dedicated to dogfighters under the guise of discussing pedigrees. One of the men shares a news article about trunking, which is a myth that is just so ridiculous. We're not even going to take the time to talk about it today. But he shares this link to the news article and then says to his fellow dogfighters, quote, "Where do they come up with this blank? I guess the bait dogs were not bringing in the donations anymore and they had to make this blank up." And then another person responds to him and says that he would love to personally cull those of us that bring him major heat. So obviously not reading their words verbatim, but you get the point. Dogfighters quite literally laugh at us when those of us in welfare perpetuate these myths. Next slide. So along the lines of the bait dog myth is the myth that all dogs with scars must have come from fighting rings. Again, this is simply false. Dogs with heavy scarring could be in this state for a variety of reasons. They may have come from an environment that was lacking in resources and it led to fights. Maybe they got hit by a car, or maybe they were just an adventurous pup and got themselves into trouble along their journey through life. But to label any dog with scars as having either been a bait dog or part of a fighting operation serves no benefit other than to perpetuate the myths and stereotypes that can literally cost dogs their lives. In a paper from 2016 by Miller et al., they state, heavily scarred dogs are often assumed to be dangerous and may be euthanized for this. Next slide. So while there are other myths that pop up in the media from time to time, such as trunking that I mentioned earlier, the final myth that we feel like is worth discussing today is that dogs from fighting rings are aggressive. In a paper by Yilmaz in 2017, it stated, pit bulls are vicious due to popularity with gangs and other unpopular members of American society. And in a different paper by Kaloff and Taylor, it stated, pit bulls who injure elderly residents or young children often come from dogfighting backgrounds. So I feel like it's pretty safe to assume that if you're here today, you have probably had plenty of experiences with pit bull type dogs that have scarring and yet are extremely friendly. I don't think that we need to convince you of that. But if we look at this myth through the lens of a dog fighter, we can even better understand why human aggression in fighting dogs is not only undesirable, but actually unacceptable. So I hope none of you here today have had the displeasure of watching hidden cam videos from organized dog fights, but I have. And if you have as well, then you know that handlers are right there in the pit with their dogs, often inches from their face, and they're cheering them on. When a referee calls a break, the handlers need to be able to actually collect their dogs and move them to the edge of the pit. So if a dog displayed any aggression towards their handlers, they're at a minimum not going to be used for breeding, but it's much more likely that they're going to be killed. There are ample stories of dogs going from fighting bests to becoming therapy dogs and all sorts of other lovely things, which is proof of the fact that affiliation towards humans is actually a desired trait by dog fighters. And at this point in my career, I've had the pleasure of interacting with a significant amount of dogs from fighting cases, and I can truly say that aggression towards humans is extremely rare. Sure, there are some that are under socialized, but human-directed aggression is quite rare. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Carley.
Thank you, Morgan. So we're going to switch gears now to a brief research and literature review on this topic, which we have found to be somewhat limited, especially in regards to helping dogs that come from this background. Lee et al. Identifies that even pit bull guardians feel the pressure of myths and sometimes will identify their dog as a different breed than pit bull. They argue to others that their dog is not innately aggressive. And as Twining et al. Discusses, some pit bull guardians train their dog to engage in public appropriate behaviors so others do not perceive them as threatening. As most, if not all of us know on this call, the Michael Vick dogfighting case in 2007 was heavily highlighted in the media. While a tragic situation, the ongoing media coverage likely contributed to policy changes and recognition of this horrible sport. We don't have time to go into the details of these policy changes and implementations, but ultimately what was put into place were these acts and bills that I have here on the slide. And what they ultimately mean is that it is unlawful for any person to knowingly sell, buy, possess, train, transport, deliver, or receive any animal for purposes of having the animal participate in an animal fighting venture. Specific felony penalties were included for these policies, and they would make all participation in dogfighting, including being a spectator at a dogfight and possessing dogs for the purpose of fighting, a federal felony. As a side note, spectators commonly bring their children to these events, which is also just horrific to think about. And finally, some of the goals of these acts and bills were to increase the maximum penalty from 3 years to 5 years in prison. So we were interested in how dogfighting is revealed, studied, and discussed in the academic literature. And what we found is that most studies focused on the following: how public participants responded to dogfighting videos, the interest in how dogfighting is perceived and discussed, what types or characteristics of people participate in dogfighting, whether there's a relationship between dog scarring and dog aggression, as Morgan briefly mentioned, is a myth. And again, reviews from interviews, police files, and other online reviews to better understand how dogfighting is organized, who are the key participants, and how much does this overlap with crime-related activities such as drug dealing and illegal gambling. Ultimately, we did not find much research or literature reviews documenting specific case studies, statistics on what happens to dogs once rescued from dogfighting situations, and we feel strongly that more data needs to be reported for the public and for professionals in animal welfare to better understand various circumstances surrounding dogs from dogfighting backgrounds. We argue that all dogs should be treated as individuals, even when coming from such tragic and horrific backgrounds as dogfighting. Don't make too many assumptions based on breed, and instead learn who the individual is, what are their likes and dislikes, what's exciting or potentially fearful for them when engaging in the real world. We encourage functional assessments or ongoing interactions with individual dog in a variety of settings, such as real life rooms, a home would be ideal, walking the dog around town, interacting with known people versus known people, and more. We also encourage socializing dogs with other dogs, even when coming from these backgrounds and based on your own observations. As Morgan mentioned, if you aren't comfortable with a situation or unsure of how a dog might respond, then use a basket muzzle for additional safety and comfort level. We would encourage attempting to desensitize the dog to the basket muzzle before these interactions, but again, it really depends on the dog's ability and willingness to cope with the muzzle. So in closing, I'm going to share some more case studies that I have been part of or was a part of at some point in the dog's journeys. So here we have Maya and Carley. Maya is pictured here on the left, that's primarily Black, and Carley is Black and white and pictured with me on the right. They both were two of the 22 dogs rescued from the Michael Vick case and brought to Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. I want to start by saying that legal restrictions were put into place immediately regarding who was at the time adoptable, who was deemed unadoptable, and then there was a group that would be required to pass the CGC, Canine Good Citizen assessment, in order to be adopted. The latter group for the CGC passing is where Carley and Maya landed. So I'm about to share their journey after being rescued, but would like to note that 13 of the 22 dogs from this case were adopted from the sanctuary. Carley arrived with the initial group and Maya arrived a little bit later. When Carley arrived, the court case was still very active and very little information was known about him or the other dogs at the time of arrival. There was a lot of skepticism at that time about whether dogs with this background could be rehabilitated. Everything was extremely public as this was a high profile case. And the ultimate goal was, when receiving the dogs, was to keep them and the staff safe. So initially the dogs received 24-hour round-the-clock care, often implementing crate and kennel rotations and taking them for walks throughout the days and nights. This setup ultimately helped the dogs that were less socialized towards people because they had to go on leash for potty breaks and had opportunities to build relationships with the team. But the key thing with interactions was that nothing was really done differently than when accepting any other dog to the sanctuary. Handlers and trainers observed and took notes about each dog as individuals and discussed and noted their reactions and responses to walking past other dogs while out and about, while walking past other dogs in kennels, and walking past other people. The team, again, really didn't know much about the dog's behavior towards other dogs. So they took the information they could gather through the fence and eventually began to recognize which dogs appeared to be really wanting to engage with other dogs versus those that might not want to or were a little more hesitant. The team introduced the dogs as they normally would and used muzzles if they were a little more unsure. So these kinds of interactions I was referring to paying close attention to and logging what you are using descriptive terminology is super important for any dog or any animal. And so Maya came a little bit later after Carley, since she was first in a foster home. Due to her lack of human socialization, though, it was decided to bring her to the sanctuary to continue helping her. Being an all Black, under-socialized dog to people, and a dog that would bark when unsure, it made some people unsure of her as well. So again, that's one of the reasons that she was brought to the sanctuary for a little bit more help. At the sanctuary, interactions with Maya were implemented similar to other dogs that had arrived that were under-socialized towards people. This included hand feeding, getting used to people being around her, getting her used to the leash, and again, other techniques that would normally be used in this situation. It was soon discovered that Maya loved other dogs. After moving Maya to be an office dog and her former dog office mate was adopted, which was actually another Victory dog, it was decided to try Carley in the office with Maya. Carley was a little more unsure of other dogs than Maya, but the team felt he needed a different environment with less commotion and stress. From then on, Maya and Curly were the Dogtown manager's office dogs and eventually my office dogs for a few years. Curly continued to be unsure of the outside environment, but together they went on walks. Here they're pictured in golf carts as they absolutely loved golf cart rides, car rides, and Maya essentially became Curly's helper dog. In the middle picture, they're wearing their little laser goggles for laser therapy. Again, those that worked with Maya and Curly and other dogs from the Vick case quickly learned about their individual personalities. While Curly was unsure of the world at times, in the office, he was a complete goofball and would really open up. He seemed to love being dressed up for various holidays, as you can see here on the left. If you left your bag on the ground, he would take it and shake it like a toy. He loved his chew bones, and so did Maya, and Curly loved his crate as well. Maya was always there for the snuggles. She was not too fond of the camera, as you can possibly tell from the picture on the right, where I really had to sneak that snapshot of her in on a walk. And she really, really loved her walks. Altogether, the initial team and the future staff treated these dogs like any other dogs in their care, meaning that they learned about previous interactions with humans, dogs, and the environment from in general, and from the notes that previous staff had left about each dog. Staff built relationships with them as they would any other dogs. The main point that came across as I was discussing Maya and Curly with Michelle Weaver, who was one of the Dogtown managers at the time the dogs arrived, was that they were simply asking, as Morgan has stated, who is the dog in front of me? What does this individual dog need, and how can I help them? Again, legal restrictions were quickly put into place regarding the outcomes for the Vick dogs that were rescued to the sanctuary. As previously mentioned, Maya and Curly fell into the group that would need to pass the CGC. And while unfortunately they never did pass all components of the CGC, we think it's mainly because of Maya's uncertainty around new people and Curly's insecurities of new environments. However, if we could have changed one thing in the legal process, Michelle and I discussed that it might be that the court reassess the legal restrictions after a certain amount of time in our care, as we felt that Maya and Curly over time most likely could have adapted to a new home, and we would have loved to give them that opportunity. So another quick case study. I know we're coming up on time, so I'll rush through this a little bit. But Saru, who's pictured here in the bottom middle, came to us with about 6 to 7 other dogs from a dog fighting situation a few years ago. The initial receiving group did perform formal assessments on each dog, including how each dog responded to a stuffed dog. But ultimately, we really didn't have much information about each dog, as formal assessments are simply a snapshot in time and not accurate indicators of who a dog is as an individual and how that dog would truly respond in a variety of situations, especially when interacting with other dogs. So while Saru was under-socialized with people, that meant for him, he was a little shy at first, but would quickly warm up with treats. We learned he was pretty good with other dogs, while being a little selective, and again, appeared a little unsure at first, but if the other dog gave him a little bit of space, as his roommate Kimbra did, then he would open up and play with them, allowing several play breaks in between. So here you can see him on the right, watching his roommate Kimbra interact through the fence with a neighboring dog. And I wanted to note that co- and group housing of dogs with neighboring dogs as set up at the sanctuary can be tricky and challenging for some dogs. It can result in dogs running the fence line with other dogs on the other side of the fence. And sometimes we will see some redirecting between dogs that live together. However, we didn't really see this with Saru. He wasn't as interested in the fence line as other dogs, fortunately, since Kimbra was. But him and Kimbra made amazing roommates. Kimbra was outgoing with people. She loved people, and she liked most other dogs as well. And so in this situation, Kimbra became the helper dog for Saru. And when Saru would leave his kennel for walks or car rides, he would go about these activities much more fluidly with Kimbra by his side. Saru wasn't with us for too long before he was adopted, and is still reportedly doing well in his adopted home, as are the other dogs from this group that were adopted. Okay, sorry I went through that a little bit fast, but bringing this information all together, We have shared that dog fighting and animal fighting has been occurring for a long time and is often used to raise status and often occurs with other criminal activities. As a result, dogs that come from these backgrounds tend to carry a stigma with them that is not always true, that they are aggressive and want to fight and enjoy fighting other dogs. We continue to argue that to treat each dog as an individual. Ultimately, it is up to us to teach any animal we work with how to live in a human world, to do so through building positive relationships with animals we work with while exposing them to the real world, and sometimes needing to help them build confidence in certain situations, regardless of their backgrounds. We strongly, strongly encourage you to foster and or adopt locally, especially trying to use foster homes to learn more about the dog in front of you, as we know that the shelter setting can still be very stressful for dogs. We realize that more data is needed on this topic, but for now, there are plenty who have their own success stories to share about dogs that come from dog fighting backgrounds. Oftentimes, if you didn't tell anyone about their history, one would likely never know. So real quick, this is just about a minute and a half video that we'd like to share from best friends remembering the victory dogs. So hopefully it pulls up on the right screen, and it did not. So one second.
Carly just confirming there's no sound to this.
Oh no.
That's okay. It's still good to look at.
So I apologize that there was no sound. There's just some music playing in the background. So let me get back to my screen here, and I will toss it over to Morgan for our final wrap up.
Yeah, so that video just, I can't not smile seeing all of that. It's amazing. So thank you for sharing, Dr. Carley. So we just wanted to end by saying that, hopefully we've maybe shed a little light for you if this is a topic that you're not very familiar with. And most importantly, if you ever find yourself caring for one or many survivors, look at the dog right in front of you, listen to what they're telling you, and then don't be afraid to reach out to behavior consultants, other colleagues, anything like that. If you have questions or feel like you could use a little guidance, there's tons of resources out there and a lot of people that would be more than happy to help you with this. I know that for me, don't tell my boss, but my absolute favorite part of the job is when I get to work with people and help them with survivors like this. And I'm pretty sure Dr. Carley would feel the exact same. So don't be shy. We're here. We'd love to help if we can. And I don't know if we have time, but Dr. Sheila, did you want to try and get to some questions? Or I know we kind of went a little long.
No, we're good. We can go a couple minutes more. If anybody has to leave, we understand, but we're going to try to get to all the questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Carley and Morgan. This was absolutely incredible. I know this is a very emotional topic for many of us who have worked with or fostered these dogs or are passionate about them. And it was wonderful to see a presentation with such valuable information and with such professionalism. And also really nice to see so many of the people who have worked with these dogs in the chat here. So thanks to everyone. I'm going to jump into the questions. Feel free to type in chat if you have one. The first question comes from Heather, who wants to know, Morgan, whether you're available to provide the training for law enforcement to be able to recognize the signs of dog fighting if it were requested or someone wanted to hire you for that.
I typically don't, or well, I've never done the law enforcement training. So I have colleagues that 1000%, I would be happy to connect you with to do the law enforcement training. They're going to have even better information and ability to teach on that than I would. So yeah, reach out. I can gladly connect you and we can get a training set up for you.
Great, thank you, Morgan. And can you put, well, your email address is right there on the screen. Can you put it in the chat too? Thank you. All right, and our next question is for Dr. Carley from Amy. And the question was about whether all dogs receive the 24-hour care, or was that something that was more specific to the Vick dogs?
Yes, that was specific to the Vick dogs, as that was the first case to my knowledge, especially with that number of dogs to come into Best Friend Sanctuary with that background. So that setup was specific to them as they were learning more and more about them. They didn't want their backgrounds to taint their experiences with them. But at the same time, as I mentioned, since it was such a high profile case, first and foremost, they wanted to make sure they were doing what's best for the dogs and those that were working with the dogs and keep everyone safe.
Thank you, Dr. Carley. Next question is from Carrie, who says, I love hearing you talk about working with the individual dog in front of you. Do you think that carries over to puppies who have not yet reached social maturity? Do you monitor puppies seized from fight rings any differently than puppies of unknown backgrounds?
Morgan, how much have you worked with puppies from these backgrounds?
So truthfully, less with puppies than adult dogs. I definitely have had experiences where once they reach sexual maturity, you might see some changes in their behavior. Most often, if you're going to see a change, it's usually how they interact with other dogs. I don't know that I personally have ever or would really treat them any different than I would another puppy, and just kind of monitor as they mature and be prepared for any changes you see. But Dr. Carley, do you?
No, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, with puppies and their socialization period, it's definitely something to consider and take into consideration. But again, working through them, working with them as individuals, exposing them to the environment in different ways is the way that I would move forward.
Thank you. I know that ASPCA has done a decent amount of work with puppies. I think it was with the Missouri 500 that they had all those puppies. I don't remember if that was the case for sure, but thanks for your input on that, Dr. Carley and Morgan. And what looks like our last question, unless any more get typed into the chat, is, are there differences in physical appearance between pit bull type dogs who are purpose bred for dog fighting versus pit bull type dogs who are pet dogs?
Well, we would argue that they all can be pet dogs. I'll go really fast, and Dr. Carley, you go. There is often a look to some of them. They tend to be very on the small side. I know the media would have you believe that dog fighting dogs are these giant hulking, scary things, but dog fighting dogs typically are just really compact and little. They're usually in like the 30-pound range. So I would say in that way, yes, they may be a little different than just your average pit bull type dog. But Dr. Carley, do you feel different?
No, I echo what you're saying. Yeah, from my experience, the body types of dogs that come from these backgrounds do tend to be a little more petite. Aside from Saru, he was a taller dog, and then another dog that came with Saru from that background was actually very clearly a Chow mix, which was interesting to receive that kind of breed and that kind of type of dog. It's typically, from my experience again, and what I've read and learned about pit bull type dogs, but I echo what Morgan said and agree.
And it's not uncommon for dog fighters to have house dogs. So sometimes you will see those being the bigger, larger pit bulls, and they might use those purely for breeding, purely as an income stream. So those might be the larger, more dramatic looking dogs. But yeah, they tend to be on the little side. The dog fighters are going to pair their dogs based on weight, so they actually pay very close attention to the size that their dogs are.
Thank you. And I think if you think about it, these dogs are athletes, not the type of athletes we like to think of, but they're athletes. And so those big heads have poorer air exchange and are less efficient. So, these are dogs bred for a purpose. And while a dog who is smaller without that big head, who looks like a pit bull type dog, is more likely to be a purpose bred dog, it could still just be a pet dog that happens to look like that because that's an efficient dog that genetics is going to lean towards, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Carley and Morgan. This has been a wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone who has joined us. We appreciate you all and hope to see you all next month. Thank you.
All right.